Okay, my memory card ran out. I had to format and I gotta do this all over. Okay, these are my Neuron boards. This is all I have built so far. The way they work, I'm just gonna be try and be brief here, is there's a micro on here. I'm using the A to D inputs. On this version, I'm only using one input that you can either pull down or pull up, depending on which pins you attach to. And you see that there's this color-coded connectors here. So the blue are excite and the red are inhibit. So what happens is when you pull the input up, if it passes a certain threshold, it starts accumulating, which is a simulation of a real neuron, very crude version. What that does is it takes a sample of the input, it scales it down from a number between 0 or 1 and 120 or 1 and 25, and then it adds that number to another variable, which is the synapse. Basically, the synapse is added. So basically, if you have a higher input, then you have a faster time to fire. If you have a smaller input and they exceed that threshold, you'll charge the synapse slower. When the synapse reaches a certain threshold, it fires. It fires for approximately 20 milliseconds, and then it goes through a refractory period, or now I'm confused myself. Either way, it's just a period of time that it can't fire again, regardless of the input stimulation. And what it does is just ramps down the synapse real fast, and then it's ready for another fire. I've also added two features to this. One of them is they send out little pulses periodically. Usually those pulses aren't enough to cause them to fire, but the frequency of those pulses increases over time. And another thing, oh, by the way, this is also a leaky integrate and fire neuron. So if you charge the synapse and you let it rest and it doesn't fire, it will discharge down to a resting state. The LEDs on each board indicate the synapse charge. So green is neutral, it's the resting state. Red is inhibited and blue is excited. And then when they fire, they blink white. These particular ones here, I added something, an adaptive feature to them. The more times they fire, the harder they are to fire. So they kind of self-adjust. I need to adjust the values currently because it takes a very long time. Well, I'm going to show you in a minute, but it takes a while for them to settle down. Also, currently there's a pin on here. This is an old revision of the board, by the way. There's a pin on here where I can manually raise or lower the bias amount so that they can fire easier or fire not as easy. Like I said, they self-adjust as well. So they don't have any sensors or anything on them other than a touch sensor. There's a capacitive touch sensor. So a few of these boards are a Rev 2 and most of them are Rev 1. Here's one here. It's got a little pad right here. You probably can't see, but a little pad right there that you touch. You want to trigger it manually. So I'm going to be making visual, or Jesus, I'm going blank right now. Like light sensor versions of these, and audio sensor versions, and an accelerometer sensor version. And then I'm going to reduce the size of the circuit itself and add them to a board and to a complete robot where you can jumper them and create different behaviors in a robot. And I'm hoping to get at least 30 neurons per board, which is probably going to be pretty easy considering I'm switching the micro down to a smaller one. You see it's right here. It's fairly small already. It's 4 millimeters squared. Okay, so they have each one has an excite input and an inhibit input. So the inhibit inputs, which are red, pull the they pull the bias. They make the bias less, pull it down so that the neuron is less likely to fire. And the excite is the exact opposite, makes it more likely to fire. You can have them excite or inhibit themselves. And because of the pinging action that they get between each other even when they're not triggered, you can feed an output to an excite input and get them to fire on their own or fire other ones. I may change that in the future. The reason I added that feature was to give you an indication of how they're connected without actually having them fire, but because there's no sensors on them, I thought it was important, I guess, to have them fire periodically and it also creates a lot of chaotic and random behavior. So right now I've disconnected what I had previously, and I'm going to in a minute power them up and show you the adaptive behavior of their bias. So what you're gonna, so they're connected in a loop. So basically, it goes from here around to this one, and then it goes to this one, and then it goes around to this one. And I did that just so you can get an idea of how many different states you can have with just a chain. There are no inhibits connected currently, all excite. So when I power them up, you're going to see this thing full bore, totally chaotic, basically like an epileptic seizure, where there's like just a maximum amount of processes or pulses going around the chain at once. But as you sit here and watch it, you will see that over time it will adapt and calm down a little. I'm going to change that later and make it so it slows down. So when I power them up, they will start out neutral, and then they will almost immediately start firing. Okay, so now they are constantly, they're saturated, and you'll see that hopefully my battery doesn't die or whatever, because this camera is a little flaky. So this takes a little bit of time, but you can start, if you stare at it, you can actually see waves of patterns in there. It isn't just a uniform thing. And when you connect them in a different different ways, you can get all kinds of weird things, even without sensors currently. So you see that it's slowing very slightly, and eventually we'll get to a state where it's just one single pulse rotating around. That's the equilibrium there, as it tries to balance itself out to that point. Obviously, if you have inhibits and other things going on, it's going to offset that. What I usually try to do, since I only have 12 as an even number at least, is I create two loops, like this inner circle and this outer circle, and then I have the outer circle inhibit the inner circle, and then I have the inner circle inhibit the outer circle. So what happens is one of them will spontaneously fire up, and it will suppress the other one. So as long as it's running, but what happens is you get this little window of opportunity for the suppressed one, and it will fire up spontaneously and then knock out the other one. And so they'll kind of like fight back and forth, and it seems completely random. So you see, it's not as fast as it was before. It's quite different on the camera than it is in person. The camera kind of slows it down a little bit, which makes it actually easier to see. So they're all individual, and they're all running off RC internal oscillators, which you know are not perfect. And then the camera, it looks as if the the pattern is almost like a fan. But now it looks different actually. But like I said, it's just a small loop, and then it goes around, and then it goes back to the center, and then it goes around. So I'll make a separate video showing what happens if you add some inhibits. There we go. There we go. So now we're getting one pulse, it looks like, traveling around the loop. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 2 jumpers, 0402 size, little tiny jumpers, which will allow you to enable or disable certain features like the pinging. If you want to turn it off and you have sensors attached, you don't want any random startups, you can do that. And if you want the adaptive feature off, you can do that. Now, this is still something I'm testing, this adaptive thing. I don't know if I even like it yet, or if it's bugged or not, because it very well could be. So now, so you see the blue, and what that is right before it fires, it's excited, so that it fires, and then after it fires, the synapse is completely drained, which is why you see red. And then they do recover, so that's why they turn back to green. Some recover faster than others. Honestly, I have no idea why. They're all a little different. And now you're starting to get the chain broken a little bit. So they're very, very slowly lowering their bias, which is making them harder to fire. So they're like basically on the cusp of firing now, which is why we get the slow and the pause. But they'll reach a state where they the only thing I see that I just realized is they aren't pinging, or are they? I can't tell. And the only time that they may allow themselves to become harder or easier to fire is when they ping a certain amount of times. If they're not pinging, they're just pulsing like this, and that pulse is coming through just fast enough to not let it ping, then what will happen is the bias will get lower and lower. But eventually it will stop, and the chain will stop, and then it will start pinging, and it will start to increase again. And if you inhibit them, you can get them to ping more often, which makes them easier to fire over time, and they'll fire up again. But so I have 50 blank boards still, but I need to get the cash to build them all up and assemble them in a giant cluster. I also have, see, these are the connectors. Each board has a standoff, a built-in standoff on the, 2 built-in standoffs on one end of the board that's threaded. So all you do is put a 440 screw in here, and you can attach 2 others, and you can put a number 6 standoff in the bottom of this connector to hold the whole thing up. The power is connected on the bottom through the same type of wires. I put them on the bottom to reduce the clutter, because it was really confusing. And the ground is distributed evenly through the ground planes of each board and through the connector boards, and you can actually tap into it here with the bare metal on the edge. I also have some T's and crosses, connectors that I'm going to order to be able to come up with different shapes. I'd really like to be able to create some metal versions of this that can be bent, and then you can create like a ball, for example, or other geometric shapes out of them. So eventually I want to create like a giant cluster So once I get my 50 boards made, I'll have roughly 62 or so. Actually I have 2 other ones in there. 64. And I'm going to hook them all together. Okay, so now I'm just going to go in here while the camera's still working and not telling me the battery's dead already, which it usually does. I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to add something. So this here, I believe, no. This here and this are the last in the loop. So this input here is what links the inner loop, what the hell, to the outer loop. What's happening is it's firing using the pings. So now that even though the loop was broken, but we can